Not so long ago, in a world full of strife, a man born a wolf, living a dual life. With magic in his veins, he walked the school hall, learning the arts, answering the call. But fear was a cloak he had to wear tight, hiding his truth, keeping darkness from light. Those who were scared turned away in despair, yet he bore the burden, he chose to take care. Now the times have changed, the monster's no longer scared. He's retired from magic, but his stories still flare, with tales of heroes, of legends so grand, selling dreams of the past across this vast land. In the shadows he lingered, where darkness would creep, protecting those kindly, never losing sleep. A guardian of secrets, a keeper of lore, he wandered through echoes, hearts wanting much more. No longer the wolf, but a sage with a pen, turning back the pages, reliving back then. His stories weave magic in the minds of the young, of battles and triumphs, where songs will be sung. Now the times have changed, the monster's no longer scared. He's retired from magic, but his stories still flare, with tales of heroes, of legends so grand, selling dreams of the past across this vast land. Listen closely, hear the whispers in the breeze, of knights and of dragons beneath the ancient trees. The wolf in his wisdom has so much to share, from magic to courage, loving hearts laid bare. So gather round, children, let the stories unfold, of a man who had magic but chose to be bold. Through tales of old, his spirit survives, a wolf in disguise, in every heart he thrives. Now the times have changed, the monster's no longer scared. He's retired from magic, but his stories still flare, with tales of heroes, of legends so grand, selling dreams of the past across this vast land. So remember this lesson as you look to the skies, even hidden beneath, we see with our hearts, not our eyes. For every wolf's journey, there's magic in the tales of kindness and courage, where love prevails. Not so long ago, in a world full of strife.
Oh, I'm not here. I'm a disembodied voice. This is what happens when you notice the time and rush to get things started. You forget to start things. Of course, oh, yeah, it's still got 20 some odd seconds left of the ads. And maybe VTube Studio will start. Would not be the first time it's been this scuffed. Oh, wait, it's trying to open. I'm out of here. Let's see, which model will it be? Ah, okay. But yeah. Congrats on getting first, as opposed to 6th or 7th. Okay, what is KLM? Besides, an airline. I'm going to have to look that up because I do not know. Royal Dutch Airlines. What does KLM mean, though? Oh. Koninklijk Luchtvaart Maatschappij. That makes sense. If you're Dutch. Hey, guilty. Congrats on second. Oh. Yes, it is back to the cowboy book again tonight. Let's see how much we can get done. I think we're a little over halfway through the book. Let's see, page number, we're on 115 out of... I'm not going to read all the bibliography of 224, so yeah, a little over halfway through. 115 out of 224, so 109 pages left. It took 30 streams to get this far, unless I forgot to update the part number. Not bad. Of course, I have another Western biography that I picked up to do after this one. That's someone that's not related to me. I actually found the book about Pistol Pete, written by his wife. So I guess I'll do that one when I finish this one. And no, he wasn't just a pizza guy. He was actually a cowboy. But yeah, it'll be interesting to read that one. I would read Conman Crooks and Courtesans, but all you have to do is look at the government to see that. I don't think this one does. I'd say you might be able to get some 6-7 in because one of the ranches is the C7, but that's about it. Cowboys don't say ejaculate. Especially since the woman who wrote this cowboy's biography went on to write Christian books. I don't think ejaculate's going to be in this very much. But anyway. That was funny. It posted it with ejaculates spaced out in the auto mod. That's just weird. As it started with the ejaculates space W. I left the E spaced off of it too. Which is just weird. Let's see, what time is it? 9:06. Let me grab a bit of my coffee. Which has no whiskey in it because I don't know whiskey. And if you donate to my coffee fund, I might be able to afford whiskey. I'm sure Kel will put up the coffee link eventually. Anyway, let's see, we finished chapter 10, so this is bankruptcy. No, it's chapter 11, Breaking in Old Outlaw. After the shipping was over, my job was to ride the range and brand any unbranded animal I might find, and I branded quite a few yearling and a few 2-year-olds that had been missed in the roundup. I saw that the boys detailed to cut ice kept the water holes open and the line riders were on the jobs, and kept the fences in good shape and gathered poor cattle that needed to be fed. You worked in North Dakota and I in South Dakota, as the state line cut Morris and Company in two. About the 15th of December, winter set in the good old-fashioned Dakota way. It had frozen and snowed for a month, but would warm up and melt in a few days. But on or about the time of blizzard drifted cattle in from the north to the prairie to the Badlands, where they found protection in the way of deep canyons and timber-high bluffs and mountains. We could do nothing until the storm subsided. Then I had to go and get all the boys together and take a chuck wagon, bed, feed wagon, and push the cattle out of the southwest corner. We really suffered on that trip. There were 14 men in the bunch. The only winter I could remember suffering so much was from the cold, was the winter Joe Beckham was killed in Stutter's line camp. That was a beastly winter in Texas. One man in my group was named Jack Brown. He had come there from El Paso in July, and had been on the north side of the range all the time in line camp until all his part was vacated and he needed other work. He joined the herd to bring them back, and somehow got lost from the men while gathering the cattle. He did not find the wagon until after he had frozen to death. His faithful horse brought him in frozen to a block of ice in the morning after he got lost. His horse was standing at the feed wagon, and poor old Jack was sitting straight up with the bridle reins in his hand, one hand clutched over the saddle horn. Before we got back off that miserable trip, one man's horse slipped and fell to his right foot hung in the stirrup and twisted his knee out of joint. He was dragged and kicked almost to death before his foot came loose. Several of the men had their feet and ears frozen. But such is the life of a cowboy, and he might expect anything, and it is not in keeping with his character to grumble. By the time he returned to the ranch, Mrs. Hardy had gone to Chicago to spend the winter months with her mother. The cook had gone off to spend his accumulated wealth, for old John was thirsty. John had been taking a liking to me. When the boys would tease him about my being the runt of the ranch, he would tell them I could ride any damn horse on the entire Indian reservation. I always helped John with the dishes, and I shared my bed with him since he got none. Old John was a good blacksmith, so when Mr. Hardy wanted me to go along with the haying outfit, I told John to take the job, that I would be at the hay camp every few days to see about him. Everything was running nicely when one day at noon, as the boys were catching up on their teams, Ben caught out a span of brown Hamilton horses, and that had been brought for saddle horses. As Ben was a good rider, and very strong, he was given these two half-broken horses to work. While he was bridling one of them, the other broke loose and ran off. Of course, his mate followed, and he was taking Ben right along with him. He was going so fast, Ben, I suppose, thought he must be flying, for he only hit the ground once as the horse broke away from his to follow his mate. The catch rope was tied to one end of the horse's neck, the other end is loose, and had caught Ben's spur and was holding fast, making him slide with him. The horse wrangler was a quick pursuit. The rope came off the spur after Ben had been taken about half a mile from camp. He had to come back to camp to let his spirited team go for the day. I think Ben found he didn't need spurs to ride a moving machine, for the next time I went to camp, I saw his spurs in old John's toolbox. The next morning I saw two horses grazing near the south side of the pasture, and noticed that they kept raising their heads, looking towards the river, as though they were looking for something. I suppose they were mustangs or Indian horses. I'd seen them on the hilltop, and I knew they had not seen me. I went to the old L7 ranch headquarters that day for lunch, and while there learned about the horses getting away from the hay camp. I told Mrs. Adams, who lived there, I was sure I had seen a runaway horses that morning, and I would get them that evening and take them to the hay camp that night. I told her that if anyone came hunting for them, tell them I would follow the horses until I caught them. The old L7 headquarters, where Mr. and Mrs. Adams lived, was in distance only long enough for Byrd Rose to get all his cattle rounded up and shipped out as the C7 had taken over. I left right after I ate and rode straight to the horses. The wind was blowing just right for them to scent me, and I saw them coming out of a ravine, looking my direction, and they started running. I was almost a mile from them when they disappeared over a ridge. I crossed the ravine and saw them making for the river, the very place I wanted them to go. I managed to get the wind of them, and I kept out of sight from them, never exposing my horse to their view. When they got to the water, they waded downstream and vanished behind the high banks of the river. But they had gone through a water gap in the river into a four-section pasture. I thought I had them where I could handle them, or at least could run them down by keeping in sight of them and cutting them off from the gap in the fence of the river. When I came to the gap, I stopped and dismounted in the shade of some cottonwood trees and pulled my saddle off from my horse and let it rest and cool before making another run for them. I was looking down the river and happened to see the head of one of the horses appear above the high bank of the river. He showed his long, slender neck above the bank, and I could see the heads of the other horses behind him. They just stood there for several minutes looking back the way they had come. Then they disappeared by going back the way they had come to the riverbed. I mounted and made a dash to where I had seen them, being careful not to get where they could see me from the riverbed. When I was near the place they had first shown their heads, I dismounted and crept up the bank and peeped over. I saw the horses just entering the thick grove of timber on the other side of the river. I have never seen a horse before use such diligence and cunning judgment. I rode on down the river where I could cross and get the timber on the horses and keep the windward side of them. I left my horse tied in a thick clump of bushes and crept up on foot within a few yards of them before they saw me, and before they could get away. I had caught the end of a lariat, but could not hold the horse as he was bound to follow his mate, though he was the leader of the two. I made it back to my horse and gave chase until I saw they were going into a corner of the pasture. I pulled my horse up a little and rode to a rise where I could watch them see what the fence they would travel. I was sure they would stay near one of the fences. They trotted up and down fence both ways a time or two until I saw they were going due north. I got my rope and made a run to head them off. As pasture passed between the fence and me, I threw my rope and the noose settled over his head. I knew the race had ended, but he hit the end of the rope so hard that he jerked my saddle horse down and dragged the little creature for several yards. I knew the big brown was a caught horse, for I had a strong rope in the saddle that he could not break. He soon stopped and turned his head to me, and I knew I had him. I slipped the bridle from my horse and put it on the big brown and led him up. Took the noose from over his head and tied it in my bridle reins, then slipped the saddle from the gentle horse, and I put it on the one I just caught. Hot, powerful brown stallion. I knew I would call him Old Outlaw. His mate had stopped and was watching the performance. I soon had the big brown horse saddled and ready for traveling. I blindfolded him and took my seat. He bucked and bellowed for several minutes while I did my best to cut him in two with spurs and skirt. Finally, he broke into a run and gave me the fastest ride I've ever taken for a mile or more before I could rein him in. I was near the river when he stopped running, and I made straight for the sandbar to train him on, for I wanted a good soft spot in which to fall providing I had to fall. I soon taught that noble beast who was his master. In 1 hour he would stand still for me to get on him and walk or trot off, and I could handle him with ease with the bridle bits. I found the other two horses near where I'd left them. I drove them to a corner of the pasture and caught them up as the runaway had a rope on him. Anyway, I wanted to be near his mate, which I led when I got him to the corner. The horse I had turned loose was not hard to catch. I mounted and struck out for the hay camp about 6 o'clock that evening, a distance of 38 miles. I got in around 11 that night. Thank you for the stretch and hydrate. I rode up to camp and called out for the gainer. I told him I had his runaways. While I ate, I had to tell him just how I caught the horses. I asked him if he needed a big brown horse to work. He told me he didn't, that if I wanted to get my full neck broke, I could keep him for my own use. He had never said he wouldn't have worked the horse, but nobody on the ranch could ride him, and he had run away from the hay camp last fall. That horse was a plumb devil, but a real saddle horse that I could ride as far as any man can be ridden in a day, but he was always mean to pitch. Mr. Hardy was surprised to see me ride up the next morning, leading one horse astride the other. He gave me a raise, but old Outlaw fell a few days later and broke my leg while pitching. I found a wild steer that was about 9 years old. I wanted to put it in the north side of the railroad out of the Badlands, so we could get him when shipping time came again. But the steer refused to leave his old range that had saved him from the slaughter pen for several years. He was a big, old, mossy-headed fellow that had been seen many times, but had never been driven beyond the range. I knew that my horse and I could catch him, and that was all the chance I had in getting him out. I also knew to blindfold him by putting sticks in his eyes, for that was the only way he would leave his old haunts alive. I decided to take a chance on my horse throwing him and holding him until I could tie the critter down. So, cinching my saddle good and tight, I made a dash for him as he curled his tail and made for the nearest timber where he would stand off a man by making fight with his long, keen horns. I had found him in an open glade feeding with the other cattle that could be easily driven. The old steer wore an L7 brand that Byrd Rose and Ed Lemon once had. He was one of the largest steers I had ever seen. He must have weighed close to 2,200 pounds. So my brown horse would stay on the ground and hold what he would when the old fellow was near the timbers. My rope tightened around his long horns, and as soon as Outlaw felt the steer's weight on the rope, he became unruly and unmanageable, trying to run and pitch at the same time. He got jerked down, catching my right foot beneath him and breaking my ankle. He jerked me loose and ran past the old steer, breaking the rope as he hit the end of it at full speed, and keeping it up as far as he could see. He left me to the mercy of the steer, who watched me for a second or two and made for the middle of the thick timber. I crawled to a fallen tree and placed my foot in the fork of a limb and pulled off my boot by pulling it backwards on it. Then I cut some young ash sprouts about the size of my thumb and split them. Taking my top shirt, splintered and bound my leg as best as I could, and also hung my boot onto my belt by running the belt through the ears of my boot. Then I began to look for something to make me a crutch or two from. I did not aim to sit there and petrify, nor did I want to stay around where they bury you in shallow graves with nothing but a saddle blanket. Thank you for the hydrate, Matthew. What's his 9C? Except that wouldn't work. That'd be 65. There's, 72 minus 7 is 65. Don't make me math. I'm trying to cowboy. Finally, I found what I needed. Then I started for Grand River, which was about 9 miles away. The country was very rough, and it was hard traveling, especially after it grew dark. My leg hurt me something fierce at times as I stumbled along. Sometime that night I got to the river near old Tom Fly's cabin and wigwams. I knew he might help me. I could hire them to take me to Little Eagle, the nearest Indian agency, and then I could get a doctor there. I could stay there until I could walk again. I got the squaw up, and she woke her boy. I bargained with them to take me to the doctor. I gave them $10 and my silver-mounted spurs, which are worth 10. They had a top buggy, so the old squaw was to take me to Little Eagle, and the boy was to get my horse and saddle and take them there to the ranch. I also gave them my slicker, providing he found the horse that day. I got to the doctor the next evening about 2:30. My leg was already turning black. The doctor bathed it in something and packed my foot and leg in a tub of ice up to my knee and buckled me to a chair. Then is when I suffered and cursed myself, the doctor, and the steer, not to mention that I called that crazy horse. But by freezing my leg, the doctor had calmed the fever and saved my foot. While on the reservation, I rode off to Myrtle Ashley and got several replies. See, if you were good with 10 key, you would know that problem. There were some 500 children going to school there and several white children. What time I wasn't telling stories and singing to the children, I stayed pretty close to my room. They would come to me in bunches and say, "Cowboy, sing!" Then I was able to move about and played with them. They would come up to me and say, "Cowboy, chase us! Cowboy, chase!" When I made a move towards them, they would scream and run in all directions. On going back to the ranch, I soon fitted my old job out again. It was time to gather cattle. Two of my boys had folks living only a few miles from the west side of the C7 pasture next to Lemon, and they told me that when we got up that way, we would all go over the line and have a good old country dance. I didn't care to go, but I felt I should. I had to go 16 miles from where the wagon was to that dance. We'd not start until after dark. I rode an old horse that opened all the gates on the road and running through them by knocking them down. One of the boys had been into town that day for whiskey. I'd send for a gallon of Old John because he threatened to leave if he didn't get his red-eye. He wanted to go to the dance, but by the time we were ready to go, he was too drunk to stay on his horse. After he fell off the third time, he gave up and went to bed. Everyone for miles around went to the dance. All the boys rushed into the house and got their names on the floor manager's book and were stepping to the ladies' Jake. I hung back. I never had been a good dancer. I liked music and liked to see others have a good time. I even played the fiddle a few tunes. Then while I was out in the yard with some cowboys, a young lady stepped up to me and spoke and shook my hand as though she had always known me. I thought she had mistaken me for someone else by her friendliness. She linked her arm in mine and started for the door with me. She insisted that I dance with her. She took my hat and put it away. I really felt like a darn fool. She led me right into the middle of the dance floor, and I turned red as fire. She faced the ladies on one side of the room and said, "Ladies, this is Byrd Cochrain from Texas. He works on the C7 ranch. He is not afraid of wild cattle or pitching horses or bad men, but he needs a little coaxing where women are concerned." This brought a big laugh. The boys asked me if I was going to faint or dance. I got carried high off for a few minutes. Then the bookkeeper called a free-for-all waltz, and the fiddler started the music. My new lady friend told me this was my dance with her. That was the longest waltz I've ever staggered through. That gal hugged me close, and I began to look for the door. She said that she couldn't dance unless her partner was close to her. She rested her pretty head on my shoulder all through the dance and talked and talked. I longed for the wagon and Old John. When the waltz was ended, she led me to a seat and I told her to sit down. But she told me to sit first. There was only room for one, but she insisted that I sit first. I did, and she plopped right down on my lap. She put her arms around my neck and chatted and laughed and patted my cheeks, chuckled me under the chin, and giggled. I sure was looking around for the door. I couldn't find my hat. Finally, someone came and claimed her for the next dance. She planted a kiss on my head before she left, and everyone laughed. She really made a monkey out of me. I believe her name was Lillian Ross. I tried to find my hat, but it was gone. A girl named Margaret Smoot got me next time, and I had to dance with her before I left. I finished that set and left there like a midnight dream. The others stayed and danced all night. It was about 8 in the morning before they came back to the camp. I lived through that first winter in Dakota somehow. March came at last. It brought with it those strong Chinook winds that chilled me to the bone. The wind blew hard. The wind blew so hard one could scarcely keep a hat on. The snows began to melt and the streams began to flow with sparkling clear water. The ground became spongy and would have been boggy if it hadn't been for such turf of grass which stays rich and nourishing all winter. Its stems and blades of green were up under the snow, and horses paw the snow to eat the grass. The cattle raw and root through the snow and graze on the south sides of the hills and on top where the snow was blown away, but gets very thin before spring. It snows a lot in April, but it soon melts, which soaks the earth as it thaws out, and by May the 1st, the prairies look like a wheat field with a fine prospect for a good harvest. The fall grass waving in the breeze is mighty good to see. In May of 1909, the spring roundup started, shaping up the cattle for summer grazing and branding of calves and sleepers, cattle of the nesters and the Indian careless of branding their own stock. And then came a few weeks of rest or ease when all hands were laid off or given a chance to get to town. For a puncher who has accumulated a few $100s is too independent to make a good hand. After getting the cattle on the range where we wanted them, Mr. Hardy and I rode over the entire Moore's holdings. Wayne Moore, Mrs. Hardy's brother, had the job of galloping around the pasture fence that was some 70 miles around it. He had a special horse he rode for this, and when the job was done in a week. During the fire season, C7 had to get C7 had a gray team that was never out of the corrals, and the wagon ready loaded with water barrels, and a special-made log chain for dragging out fires. They split the team when they got to the fire, and each man rode a horse on two ends of the chain. Charlie Hardy could work a herd of cattle from 1,000 to 2,000 head out in the open. He would saddle Fraser and say, "Boys, follow me." Then he would go down through the middle of them, cutting them in half, and then cut back to the center to hold them, at which there was a sight to see. During the summer, I spent many hours at the camps of the Sioux. Their camps were scattered along the Grand River. I made the acquaintance of one fine Indian girl who could speak English. Her father was Tom Fly, and was one of the best nighthawks I've ever seen. If he lost a horse, he could tell when and just how he had lost him. He could see in the dark like an owl. His wife was half-breed. I courted the girl for pastime pleasure. Many a ride we took together in that summer of 1909. She was 25 and gifted in relating the war stories of her tribe, which she took great pride in. The Sioux was a kind of tribe prone to boast. She told me many bloodthirsty scenes about the massacre of white people by their people. I heard the story of General Custer, and this was told by an old hay-raid Indian warrior. It makes shivers run over me yet to think of how brutal the Indians were. It seems to give me that old warrior much pleasure to see me horrified at his deeds of inhuman cruelty. He told me of the noted chieftain Sitting Bull and his many raids upon the helpless white settlers of the Northwest. Sitting Bull was never conquered. The government finally ordered a reward of $500 for him, dead or alive. One night at a war dance in the Grand River, where an Indian post of Bull Head now stands, one of his own warriors shot and killed him for the money. Well, that's a bit of history I didn't know. One of Sitting Bull's own Indians shot him for the reward. But yeah, that was the end of the chapter. And I didn't ejaculate once. I was tempted to expectorate a few. Okay, got it. Less than 30 minutes. How long is chapter 12? I really want to get permission to reprint this book because the printing format drives me crazy. Okay. Next chapter is slightly longer, so let's go ahead and get into it. And I can pause ads to finish. Chapter 12, Burning Inferno. That summer, we worked what was called No Man's Land, a strip of country set aside by the government 8 miles wide and extending west from the Missouri River to the west side of South Dakota, and bounded on the north by the Rosebud and Standing Rock reservations. This strip has been set aside for trail herds to be driven from Everett, South Dakota, to the Indian Reservation in western Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming, when Everett was the nearest railroad point for western stockmen. We had gathered a herd nearly 2,000 cattle and were taking them north of the railroad to turn them loose in North Dakota, and had just gotten out of the Badlands near the head of Dirty Lodge Creek on the flat level scope of country badly infested with prairie dogs, and had a good place for a cowboy to get killed by having his horse fall with him, when we noticed heavy clouds up to the northwest, and horses and cattle seemed restless. The wrangler was busy trying to keep his horses from drifting. The cattle were bawling and jittery. I knew there was a storm coming, so I rode to the point of the herd, which was strung out for a mile or more. I told Cowboy Dick, who was pointing the cattle to the left, to drop back and let them swing to the left. And whenever he got about 2 miles from the skull butt, he'd hold the herd up. I would drop back and tell the cook to make camp at the water hole near the road, known as Skull Butt Water Hole. I ordered the wagons to go to the gate of Dirty Lodge pasture camp, but from the way the cloud was coming, I saw the storm would catch the wagon before it could get to the gate. I'd pushed the herd hard all day long, and got them out of the Badlands. But, from all indications, the storm was brewing fast. It was too hot and sultry. The coyotes had been yelping for the past 2 days. Along with 12 midnight, they sat there howling, and that most certainly was a sign of bad weather. I gave instructions as I went back towards the drag end of the herd for the boys on the west side to let the cattle spread out on the left side and get as far as they could from the prairie dog town as we could before the storm burst on us. And the sun was hid then, and then we could see vivid flashes of lightning and hear the thunder coming. I took a man back from the drag end to help Negro Charlie with his team, and to help his horse wrangler, providing he could find time, for the chuck wagon team was hard to handle. 4 large gray horses, and Charlie certainly wasn't much of a horseman. The chuck wagon was very essential for the hungry bunch of cowboys. They get mighty hard to control when their stomachs are empty. I'd let spurs and pistol at the wagon at noon, for I did not want anything about me that would draw lightning. I gave Charlie orders to get his wagon to the water hole on the double. I told him to get the team loose as quickly as he could, for they would be hard to manage if he didn't get them freed from the wagon when the storm struck. His eyes bugged out, and was saying, "Well, Captain, I sure do my best to get them loose from the wagon, and I ain't going to take no chances." Just as I whirled my horse and headed for the herd, Ben Steen met me and asked, "Byrd, did you ever see an electrical storm?" "Yeah, several," I answered, showing no concern. "I never have, but I'm double afraid of lightning." I laughed and said, "I've always heard a man born to be hanged wouldn't be killed by lightning. Besides, if it's your time, you can't kick about that. Might as well be lightning as anything else." He didn't think it was very funny, and I told him to get busy. We needed him. "Be ready to do your part when the time comes, Ben. The lightning is not many miles away." He told me he had a wife and 2 children and wasn't prepared to die. I knew Ben had a family, but had never seen him act married. I stayed near him all I could. But when the storm really broke, he went berserk. The clouds were low on the ground and thick like a fog. The lightning was an awful thing to see. It seemed to run on the ground in every direction and blind both man and beast. The roar of the thunder was deafening. I saw Ben leave the herd of milling cattle as the rain began to fall in torrents. I called to him, but could not make him hear me above the roar of the thunder. I watched him get off his horse and make for a small tree. He got on his knees and put a slicker over his head. I took down my rope and rode near him, and gave him 6 good cuts across the seat. He never flinched. I got his horse and led him back to the herd. I stayed with it until the rain subsided a bit and the cattle seemed to be quieter. I took Cowboy Dick and went to the wagon to catch our horses, taking Ben's horse and saddle with me. Dick and I helped the horse wrangler pin the horses in a rope corral. I'd roped about 5 head of the night horses, and Dick was holding them just outside the gate. Just as I started back inside the corral to catch another horse, a blinding flash of lightning came, blinding and staggering me, knocking horses down all around me. When I collected my senses enough to think of what I was doing, I looked to see where Dick and the horses were. I saw him on the ground, and 2 horses lay inside the corral between Dick and me, and the 5 head he had been holding had all been killed on the tracks. I looked at the chuck wagon and saw the cook's tent had been struck by the lightning and torn down. Smoke was pouring through the top of the tent. The night hawk, or the night herder of the horses, was off his horse, and the day herder, wrangler, as he was called, was in a daze, and naturally hardly any of us realized what had just happened. I called to him as I staggered to where Dick lay. I stopped and turned the old man over tenderly. I picked him up carefully and wobbled him to the wagon. When I got there, I found Charlie under the wagon, holding to one of the black wheels and praying to the Lord. He said, "Byrd, for God's sake, leave the dead man outside." I made Dick a bed. Charlie helped me to prepare it in one corner of the dilapidated tent. Then we put out the fire. The old cook stove had been struck, and the cans and pots and pans and fire were scattered all over the tent. Several beds were smoking and trying to burn up. I took one last look at my friend Dick. For one brief moment I wondered who had left behind to mourn him. I had never heard him boast of a family, and he never wrote a letter to anyone I knew of. But all the men all liked Cowboy Dick. The nighthawk came to the tent. He asked if I intended to catch any more horses. I told him we would. He said, "You'll have to move more of the corrals, Byrd. The horses have broken out, and I can't put it up myself. I can't put it back in the same place because of the dead horses that were in the way." I may not have said ejaculated, but I have said Cowboy Dick at least 8 times. I went with him, leaving the Negro with Cowboy Dick, and didn't stay long. I hadn't gone far when I heard water splashing behind me. When I looked around, I saw Charlie coming at top speed. When he got even with me, he said, "Boss, I just came to hope you would put up that corral." I was aggravated with him now and ordered him back to cook some supper. I told him if he didn't, the lightning would strike him for sure. He stopped and looked so scared and pitiful at me, and I began to laugh. He said, "Please, Mr. Byrd, don't leave me alone with that dead man, 'cause I can't cook, and him in that tent. Oh, God have mercy on your black child." I saw it was no use, so I went with him and helped him carry Dick outside. We got the corral rebuilt, and I caught fresh horses. Then the nighthawk and I took them to where I had left the herd. But no herd could we find. It had gotten so dark, I finally located them by the lightning playing on the steer horns. I took the men their fresh horses and sent half of them at a time to camp for supper. I heard some of the cowboys say that this would be their last year to herd cattle on the Badlands of Dakota. The boys asked about Ben. I told them I had his horse and had taken it back to camp, but had left him standing on his hands and knees talking to someone. Some of the boys expressed ill feelings towards Ben for moving to be a coward. They asked me why I took his horse, and I said I just wanted to see what kind of yarn he would tell when he comes back. I hit him 6 times with my rope, and he didn't even seem to know it. He was so scared of the storm. The next morning, we dug a shallow grave and placed sod over Cowboy Dick. We marked his grave with his name and date of death. His horse smelled of his dead master's hand, and he stood near and seemed to know Dick was gone. The storm had passed. The sun was shining, and the day was perfectly clear. But at 11 o'clock, Ben appeared. He told the boy how his horses had stepped into a prairie dog hole, fallen, and jerked him loose from it. He told them he tried to follow, and the horse got lost, and he tried to get sympathy by telling them what a hard time he had had finding his way back. When I came in, the men told me about his wild story. He had seen his saddle horse and wanted to know who found it. I told him I brought the horse in when he quit the herd. I let him know I saw him get under the tree on his hands and knees and head cowered. For a cowboy to desert in an emergency was unthinkable. I told him to stop lying, that we all knew the truth. The men sat looking at him in disgust as he shirked his duty as a cowboy. He bowed his head and confessed he was scared to death. I mentioned his wife and children, and asked him why he hadn't sent money to them. He just walked off with no reply. I'm not sure what Cowboy Dick's favorite food would have been. But Dick died. I was just a stiff. We arrived at the ranch the following day and turned the herd loose north of the railroad, then told Mr. Hardy about Cowboy Dick. We all felt badly about our friend. Mr. Hardy instructed me to do all I could to locate any kin he might have. I immediately went to Fort Yates, Everett's, Deadwood, and Spearfish, and even visited some old-timers, but most of my information came from Mr. Oliver Rose, wagon boss for his brother Byrd Rose, and Mr. Ed Lemon, whom Dick had worked for the past 30 years, until they sold to Morrison Company. He had come to Wyoming in the year 1881 with a herd of cattle from Texas. He had been called Dick and Cowboy Dick by all who knew him. When he had taken up his homestead at Fort Yates, North Dakota, he signed his name as Cowboy Dick. If he ever wrote a letter to anyone back home, or if he had any relations, Mr. Rose had never known about it. He was 55 or older. He never drank, gambled, or caroused around with any of the boys. He had a kind word for everyone who treated him as they should, and tended strictly to his own affairs. He worked about half a year, and then the rest of the time he did as he pleased, mostly trapping, hunting, or just off somewhere to be alone. He had around $2,000 in the bank in Fort Yates, and had a 160-acre home, plus a camping equipment and a horse. That horse would come to Dick as far as he could hear him calling his name. Dick always shared his meals with him, and that was all we ever knew. And now you know all about Cowboy Dick. On my way back to the ranch about 10 in the morning, I had just gotten out of the Badlands when I noticed the farmhouse on fire. I was no more than 30 miles from headquarters, but I saw the old two-story house was burning fast. I couldn't tell if anyone was trapped in it, for it seemed deserted. I turned old Outlaw from the road and headed in for the house at its best speed. When I neared the gate, I was closely watched the house, and we saw something moving in an upstairs window, but I couldn't tell just what. Quickly, I dismounted at the gate, and I heard the stifled cry of a small child above the crackling roaring of a fire. My heart began to pound in my breast. I realized there was life in that house, and possibly several small children. At the west end of the old house was on fire, but the roof on the east end had not yet begun to burn. However, the flames were leaping high and fast, and would soon consume the entire dwelling. Panic-stricken, I circled the house on foot and tried to open all the outside doors, but to my horror, they were all securely bolted. I called, but got no answer. I ran a few yards off from the house and looked again at the upper window. There I saw what made my stomach turn. 3 sick little children were standing there sobbing and screaming for help. One appeared to be no more than 6 months old, and he was being held by a child who was about 7. A little boy clung to the windowsill, and I could see that he was hysterical, though I couldn't hear his wailing. Needless to say, I realized the urgency of the situation, and it scared me speechless. Now, for a cowboy, he wasn't a dick. Most cowboys are dicks. That I know of, anyway. Again, I called out. I screamed at the little girl. "Raise the window, child, and drop the baby into my arms. Hurry, I'll catch him." I held up my arms to show her that I was trying to tell. "I'll catch the baby," I yelled. But for some reason, she didn't heed. She was by then almost overcome with heat and smoke. For a moment, this old rugged cowboy took time to pray. 3 little faces peering at me, 3 babies waiting for my help. If I was to save them, I had to think fast. I got Outlaw and my rope. I rode to the end of the house furthest of the scorching flames and readied my lasso in one hand and sprang into the saddle with both of my feet, placing one foot on the saddle horn and the other on the cantle of my saddle. And now I could reach the lower sash of the window, but could not raise it. I could hear the pitiful cries, and I prayed again for help. My horse would not stand still, for he was not gentle, and the roaring flames and heat were scaring him. Suddenly he moved away, causing me to fall. Precious time lost. When I got up, I was choking, gasping for breath, and I felt scorched. My hands were bleeding from the cuts I had gotten from the broken fragments of the glass that had been left in the window sash. I jumped back on my horse and made it to the window where the little ones waited. I finished breaking open the window, and grabbed the baby, and ordered the two children to crawl through. I lowered them to the ground, then crawled and dragged the little baby with me out of the heat of the burning house, and none too soon. It was by then swaying and crumbling to the ground. I had gotten only a few yards out of the way when the window we had come through crashed to the ground and was quickly consumed by the burning inferno. I staggered to my feet and carried the little gasping child with me to escape the awful heat. Then I saw a man and a woman coming in at a dead run towards the house. The man met the little girl and boy, and the mother ran to me and frantically cuddled her baby to her breast, crying and thanking God in one breath. The baby was coughing, but was not hurt. She clutched my hand, and both she and her husband began to thank me all at once. They cried and hugged their children. Both were so overcome with gratitude and exertion they wept in each other's arms. She broke every time she tried to thank me. Many years later, after my own children were born, I thought of this couple was so gracious and kind to me for what I had done. I told them that I had done no more than any other cowboy would have done when facing the situation. Lily told me she had locked the doors on the children to keep them in while she went out to the field to help her husband with the crop. She said she would never lock the children in a house alone. She did not know how the horse had caught fire, how the house had caught fire. They did not know how the house had caught fire, but it burned to the ground. I happened along just in time to save those children from a fiery death. The couple had seen me coming out of the Badlands, so they had also seen me as I started for the house. They knew I was their only hope for the children, since they were afoot. I rode on that day, but I shivered for weeks thinking of every time I thought of those children and the responsibility of saving their lives. I saw those pleading eyes peering through the glass at me, and when I slept at night. Without Outlaw, who stood by me in every try, I never would have made it. I would have been completely powerless. It was late when I returned to the ranch and turned into my little hot roll. The next morning I had breakfast with Mr. and Mrs. Hardy, and I told them all I could about Cowboy Dick, and I told them about the burning house. This time I could hardly suppress the tears. Mrs. Hardy said, "You've always been in the right place at the right time, Byrd." I left the ranch the next morning for the cow wagon, which was some 40 miles from the Grand River. I rode until dark, and I happened upon a little Indian church and graveyard. Since the night was nippy and I was hungry, I decided to go inside. My horse began snorting and raising a good deal of fuss as though he smelled something he did not like. The little white church and the white crosses over the graves of the dead looked ghost-like in the moonlight. Everything was still as midnight, except for the snorting of Outlaw. I had taken my saddle inside the house after staking my horse to a large flat stone that made the doorstep of the church, and standing there debating in my own mind whether to sleep in the church or outside on the grass. I didn't like the way my horse reacted to the situation. I had heard tales of this particular graveyard, and I began to look around me. I took my slicker from my saddle, and just as I spread it on the floor, bent over, almost leaning against the wall, in the dark, bent over, almost leaning on the wall in the dark corner. A long, icy, cold arm went around my neck, and something grunted in my ear. I was given a terrific jerk. My hat was rubbed off against something soft and hairy. A chill racked through my body, and I was held by my neck in a vice-like grip so tightly I thought surely a ghost had me. I let a sudden kind of yelp and made plans to vacate that church. Suddenly, I grabbed a pair of legs and gave a yank down, and came together with me, and pulling up, I looked like a locoed horse, bucking like a yearling, though I doubt if ever a yearling jumped as high as it did in my feeble efforts to get to the door. My head was being held close to someone's breast, and my hair was falling about my head and shoulder. I could have shot the assailant, but I didn't want to kill, just get away. Arms were thrown around my rusty old neck, and try as I would, I could not get those arms unclenched. So out the door I went, dragging a body behind me. I could see little of the gray hair we got into the moonlight. It was an Indian woman. She was panting, and her heavy bosom clung to me. She was panting, and her bosom heaving as she clung to me. I continued to struggle with all my strength. I pushed and pulled and jerked and twisted and dragged her around and around before I got myself free. She sank to the ground completely exhausted. I soon found out that she was the crazy Indian woman who had lost her son, who was buried in the graveyard. She thought I was her boy. She remembered seeing her son last in the church and could not accept the fact that he was dead. She had, it seems, been playing ghost in that little church for 3 years. Some of the cowboys had shot her in the dark a few times, not realizing who she was. I rode up to the top of the little rise, unsaddled again, and curled up my slicker and blanket for the remainder of the night. I couldn't help but laugh every time I thought about the scare that the old woman gave a careless, carefree cowboy. I thought I'd met my match that night. I left at daylight the next morning and had breakfast with the boys at the wagon. I stayed there the remainder of the day and until the next morning. I got plenty of teasing about the church ghost. When I left, I rode over the range visiting lion camps and visiting Indian camps to make sure they had no stolen meat. I was on the go all the time. Many times I visited Indians, both young and old. I saw some sad scenes among Indians. I've sat by a sick Indian as he lay on a single cowhide until he'd been tanned till he was soft as cloth. They had no bed or pillows as white children had. When they died, if they had a casket, it was one that was dug out of a cottonwood tree and had no lid, just sticks laid over the top of the hole which had been dug into a log to hold the body. The grave was never dug over 18 inches deep, then covered with sticks and a little dirt placed over that. I'd been running a steer or something and had my horse step on an Indian grave with me leaving the body exposed to the sun and wind. If an Indian child died, its cup and spoon were always buried with it. Death rates were high among the Indian children from lack of proper nourishment. So time passed, and in November, while we were working country near the Black Hawk Mountains, one of the boys jumped an old steer that caused me to get crippled. He did not molest him, but reported it to me. I had to catch his best horse and use an old outlaw. We went in search of the old ox. Finally found him in this clump of ash timber, all primed and ready to fight. The timber was so thick that a man could not ride through it on horseback. I stripped myself of chaps and spurs and went in after him on foot, taking a catch rope with me. He was afraid of me on foot and would not let me get near him. I had followed him for 2 hours and was about to give up when the old fellow suddenly changed his mind and turned on me, not in time for me to put up a bush. I got my hat and scrambled to get up and stomped to trample in my ground. While he was about that business, I managed to get my loop on the catch rope over his horns and got him tied to a young ash tree about 8 feet above the ground. The tree would give when he pulled hard, but would not break, which made him more secure than if he had been tied to a solid tree. He hadn't a chance now. I kept tormenting the old fellow until I got him tied close up to the tree with both ends of the rope on his ornery head and tied to separate trees, making him doubly secure. I yelled for my companion who had left with my horse and was on the lookout for the steer if he had taken to open ground. He soon joined me, and the next job was to throw the steer. I had to blindfold the critter, so after I made the sticks for his eyes, I got my partner's rope on both of the steer's hind legs and gave the other end to him and to him to hide. I got my partner's rope on both of the steer's hind legs and gave the other end of it to him, which he tied to a saddle horn. I got the old fellow by the tail, and in no time we had stretched him out on the ground. I made quick work of putting his flattened sticks in his eyes, cut my rope from his neck, and made a run for my horse. The other man gave slack on his rope by backing his horse out, and the steer got up very furiously and followed my partner into the thicket. He could not see, and charged every noise made by the horse, as he wanted revenge. He ran against trees and anything that grew in his way, and soon became cowed. In a few hours we had him in the herd and beef cattle with his conquered steer. I sent him and the herd directly to the ranch so the sticks in his eyes would be removed. I went into the stock pens at the ranch 8 days from the time we captured him, and then I found myself wishing I'd let him free. The shipping of the cattle was drawing to a close again, and we were all worn out from the long cold nights herding, and was almost finished with our work when on the 6th of December it came one of the worst snowstorms that the old Indians of the country had ever seen. We had some 400 cattle We had some 400 head of cattle trying to get them to the ranch so we could get on to winter quarters. Water holes were frozen. We had to cut the ice for the cattle so they could drink, and some were beginning to needing, especially after the heavy snows that had fallen. We were making our way along the backbone of a long ridge that wound through the Badlands on the north side of the Grand River, and we were not over 15 miles from headquarters. The snow was falling fast, and the wind blowing pretty hard the morning that we started out. So I sent 2 men with the chuck wagon and the remuda of horses, telling them not to stop for noon, but to try to get to the ranch before the snow got too deep for the wagon to travel. I told the men that we were driving the horses not to get too far ahead of the wagon, as old John might get lost in the snow. The wind increased, and the snow fell faster until it was almost impossible to make the cattle move. They were compelled to face the snow almost all the way. In places the snow was drifting high and hard, and to get the cattle through the drifts we worked hard and were cold and hungry when we reached the ranch that night. Turning the cattle loose in the horse pasture, we made our way to the barn to put up our tired and hungry horses. Then we made our way to the north end of the big longhouse. The 3 north rooms were being used by the boys for a bunkhouse. As soon as I got the snow brushed off a bit, I asked about my friend John. I had not seen his wagon outside, nor had heard him say, "There is my boy." Percy Smith and some of the others had left with John that morning, and they thought he was close to their heels until they got to the horse pasture fence. They began to look for him, but in vain. They had put the horses in the pasture and waited for him, then backtracked and found no trace of him. The blowing snow had covered all the tracks, and it was useless for me to try to find him that night. The night was pitch dark, and the snow was falling so fast a man couldn't see his horse's head. We did search around the horse pasture, thinking probably he had missed the road. No trace. The next day we continued our search, but it was no use. The gullies in the Badlands had been blown full of snow, and one might almost ride over a wagon and team and not see it. We were sure that he had missed the road and was in some ditch or canyon and was likely frozen to death. This thought kept me going for 3 days looking for my friend John. I kept thinking if I could just get the old fellow in time, I would save him. I didn't want his to freeze. I had to get him back to work. We got cars and shipped out the last cattle that shipped that year from the C7 ranch. My job had been hard that year, and my sorrow deepened by the loss of John. Everything was wrapped in a blanket of snow. All areas looked alike to me. I had to go from one camp to another, gathering poor cattle and seeing that they were fed. I had to see that the ice cutter kept all the holes open, and that the line riders kept the fences. I had to help keep the stock from drifting, and I lost several times. I nearly froze to death and did lose 2 men. My horse took me in several times that winter when I lost my way. I would just give him the bridle reins, and he would take me to some camp. Not always the one I wanted to go to, but I don't mind. Usually he tried to make it to the ranch, for there was better protection and food. My ice cutter, Horace Twido, was found frozen to death. His horse had fallen on him and dragged him for several miles before he was found. Poor old John was found the next spring. In a clump of trees we found the wagon and team and John. The team had taken down a ravine and traveled until they got into the timber and could go no further. They had starved and frozen to death, a little over 3 miles from the road that they had left. John was huddled up in the middle of the wagon. I don't know why John didn't get out of the wagon and build some kind of fire and turn the horses loose. He had plenty to eat in the wagon and the snow for water. Also, there were beds in the wagon. Horace's old horse was still alive when he was found in the saddle spring still on him, but he was nearly cut into by the cinch. He was no good from then on. And that was about it for the year of 1909 in Dakota. Okay. Barely made it. The ads are about to start. Seeing a few. Okay. Hopefully the ads are over. Although the fact that Kel points out that Darth Parmis was under the paradox of Cowboy Dick's demeanor. I think we might be able to do 3 more chapters. I have one more that's 10 pages, and then 2 that are, I think one's 5, the other's 4. I'm definitely going to be spending the weekend editing videos again, because I really do try to clean this up. Not that I would talk about Cowboy Dicks anyway. And sorry I didn't see you come in, Corey, but thank you for being here. I really do want to just retype this entire thing, because I'm finding so many mistakes. But this was actually done, for all I can see, with print blocks. Because you can see where typeset isn't straight. I think this was actually printed by a place who did newspapers. The publishing company doesn't exist anymore. And I said Byrd himself is dead. And the author, Valerie Owen, died 3 years ago. So I don't know if I'd be able to get permission to reprint it or not. But I kind of really want to. But there's only one edition of this printed. And my family was given this copy of the book. So let's get back into the story. Chapter 13, in the spring of 1910. I was riding in the area of the old L7 headquarters again one day early in April, so stopped in to visit George and Mattie Adams and the baby. I found the house deserted and in complete disorder. Mattie's dress and shoes were scattered around, and the baby's things were all here. I went to the barn and found George's saddle, but no bridle. The little horse pasture gate was open, and I saw Mrs. Adams' tracks in the sand. Since she weighed about 250 and wore a large shoe, it wasn't hard to know her tracks. I followed the horse's tracks until I was sure they were headed to the C7. I could tell that the horse was heavily loaded and traveling fast. I followed the tracks and was soon able to tell the little horse was tiring from his load and was being pushed hard. George and Mattie had come to Dakota from Palo Pinto County, Texas. They had come to the homestead, but were short of money and had to work a year or two before taking up a claim. George had been hired to ride the fence. When I was within 2 miles of the C7, I came upon the little pony they had ridden. He was dead and stiff. I could see the prints upon the chain upon where his hand legs and flanks. I could see the prints of the chain upon his hand legs and flanks where he had been beaten as he carried his double burden. I was mad and determined to find out what had brought on such brutalness. I wanted to know why George would beat his horse to death. As I neared the ranch house, the cook came to meet me and was laughing hard as he met me. I was upset and went straight to the corral, ignoring his foolishness. He knew why I was there. I knew Adams and his wife had pulled some crazy stunt which had cost the life of a pony. I had ridden 20 miles in little more than an hour, so my own horse was in need of rest and food. The stable boy told me where I could find George. He told me that he was in the house in bed, or bathing his wife's legs where he had beaten them with a chain that morning trying to escape the Indians. I rushed into the house and was met at the door by Mrs. Hardy. She laughed and asked if the Indians were on the warpath. Mrs. Hardy told me the story. About 7 o'clock this morning, I heard someone running down the trail from the potato cellar to the house while I was in the backyard feeding the chickens. I looked up and saw Mrs. Adams in her nightgown and her mouth wide open. The fear of death was upon her ashen face. George was so close behind her with their baby in his arms, and it was dressed in his nightgown too. I didn't know what to think. Finally, Mrs. Adams gasped out that the Indians were chasing them. She repeated it again. The Indians are after us. They did not stop, just kept on running with her long hair all down her shoulders and the face. She ran until she got to the door of the kitchen at the bunkhouse, and she jumped into the cook just as he started out of the door with a pan of dishwater, which, of course, caused him to spill all over both of them. This caused the cook to use some foul language in front of her. I stopped George long enough. This is the worst. I stopped George long enough to find out what had happened. He told me that this morning at daylight he heard an Indian give the war whoop, and when he looked in the direction that it came from, he saw 3 Indians and their ponies. He told Mattie he would get to the horses after the little pasture and go to the ranch, but when he got back to the gate, he saw the Indians coming down the hill. His wife then met him at the gate, climbed up behind him with the baby in his arms, and they started from there. They rode the little pony to death, then ran the rest of the way here. Mrs. Hardy also told me that the Adams hadn't been there long when the 3 Indians came over the ridge, and George wanted to cook and the stable boy to help kill them. They had come on the barn and had given the stable boy the bridle and chain that Adams had left the poor dead pony. They told the stable boy a large herd of cattle was being driven across the lower end of the C7 ranch, and that there were many C7 steers in the herd. They were trying to get word to me. That was why he yelled at the Adams at that place that morning. They were hungry and had thought he would give them something to eat. Mrs. Adams had been beaten with a chain George had used to whip the pony with. Mrs. Hardy put her to bed, bathed, and poulticed her legs and feet, and George stayed with her. Mr. Hardy was at Fort Yates, and I told Mrs. Hardy I would talk to George. Mrs. Hardy tried to get me to go by the cow wagon and get all the hands before I went after the herd. I ate my dinner while I talked to George. I let him know how foolishly it acted. He looked as though he had stolen something and been caught in the act. I asked about his wife. I told George I had no use for a man who would get scared. He decided on his own to leave the ranch just as soon as Mattie was well enough to travel. I asked the cook to put up some of the provisions for me and take with me as I would be gone several days. I wanted to overtake the herd before it crossed the Missouri River. Then I asked the stable boy to send word to Fort Yates to the officers there. From what Mrs. Hardy told me about Mattie Adams' condition, I felt she might be crippled for some time. I asked George why he had hit his wife with a chain, and he said she kept telling him to hit the colt harder. She never told him he was beating her legs off. I sent George for his things in a wagon, for his wife and baby would need their clothes soon. I checked on Mrs. Adams. I looked at her bruised legs and told Mrs. Hardy the woman would have to see a doctor at once. I told them to wrap her legs in flaxseed meal poultice until they could get help. I rode that evening and all night. At daybreak I rode on top of a high hill, dismounted, and pulled my saddle from my tired horse and staked him out to graze. While it was getting light, I ate some cold breakfast. I knew that if the herd hadn't passed the hill sometimes before morning, they would be near enough for me to see them good after daylight. I was right, for as I finished eating, I walked to the northeast end of the hill, and not over 1 mile away I could see a herd of cattle just leaving their bed ground. I could see the camp not far from the herd. The herd was headed so it would pass in less than a mile from where I stood. I needed to get near enough to see the brands on the cattle before I made myself known to the men and their boss, so I led my horse unsaddled down the opposite side of the hill from the herd and into a clump of timber. I left him to graze while I took another look at the herd with my field glasses. When I was near the edge of the hill, I saw a lone horseman coming towards me in a gallop. I knew I'd been seen by someone, or this one would have been sent ahead to look over the country. I got behind a large rock and a bunch of bush and waited. As soon as I heard the horse's feet on the stones, and climbed the hillside. I can hear the squeak of leather as the horse's sides heaved as he climbed the hill. As soon as he was on top of the hill, about 200 yards from where I was hiding, he went a little past me and stopped. I took out his field glasses and began to scan the country. I placed my rifle so it would point directly towards him. I wanted to see if it's sticking from the bush. I eased a few feet to one side, then stood up in plain view. When he turned his head, he stopped with his back to me and was looking through his glasses. He had both hands on the glasses, focused on some object. "Hands up!" I quickly demanded, assuming this man was Tom Fly had warned me about. "I want this one alive," I said, pretending to be talking to my man on the rocks. I took his guns and got his rifle from his saddle holster and told him he could lower his hands. I ordered him to dismount. He turned so he could see the rifle, and I had placed it for him to see. I slipped handcuffs on him and asked him where he was headed with the herd. "Have that man lower his rifle," he said. "He won't shoot unless I say so." He wanted to know what I planned to do with him. I told him I would look over the herd first. When we got to my horse, I unlocked one wrist took his coat and hat. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Cattle from the C7 ranch," I replied. I mounted his horse and rode away after locking him to a limb of a tree. I kept out of sight until I could come up on the opposite side. When I reached his herd, there were 7 men with the herd, a horse wrangler and a cook. 9 in all. I'd never seen a harder-looking bunch. I noticed several different brands as I rode down the side of the herd. The first man I wanted to know was why I was riding the boss's horse. I told him I had known their boss back in Texas and that we'd traded horses. This did not necessarily satisfy them, but we kept a close watch on each other. I never turned my back to any of them. I ate dinner with them and hoped old Captain McBride had gotten my message. I rode off to see if I could see McBride coming. I met him on the trail, and that the old Irishman wanted to know why I hadn't arrested the whole damn bunch at noon. I told McBride to come out about a mile from the herd that night and camp, and make sure that they were not seen by the men, and if they wanted the herd to capture them. If they saw the captain and men with him, they would vanish overnight. I went back and released my prisoner. Since I had left my horse untied, it was 10 that night before I could find him. That night I moved in on closer to the outlaw's camp, rolled up my blanket, and went sound asleep for the first time in about 40 hours. It was already 1 in the morning, and awfully cold to be sleeping on the ground, so I was up early circling the rustlers' camp trying to locate McBride again. I could see a campfire nowhere, and had decided that the outlaws had gone deserting their cattle before they were having to leave the bedground and no riders were in sight. I waited for someone to show up, but about sunrise I saw 4 men coming around a little hill not far from me. I turned my field glasses on them and saw it was a captain and his men on foot. I rode over to meet them and have never seen a madder bunch. They came as near the herd as cattle as they dared to come that night, and staked their horses and turned in for a night going without coffee to keep from building a fire. One of the men could not sleep, so he got up and went to restake the horses, only to find no horses at all. He went back, woke the others, and they had been walking the rest of the night. They had circled around their camp looking for the horses, and when they decided to try to get some more sleep, they couldn't find their beds, saddles, or food. McBride had left his Stetson at his bed, and his bald head was burning in the sun. When he saw my prisoner grinning at him, he snapped, "You need to be so smug, or I'll take that hat and your horse." I gave McBride my hat and my horse to calm him down. Then one of the men spoke out of turn. "Cochrain, maybe you had your horses stolen for all we know. I kind of believe you would do that kind of thing." I knew if the situations had been in reverse, McBride would have been laughing himself silly at me. But he was taking this quite seriously. I ignored the man's accusations and told McBride I would have taken the prisoner from Bullhead and turned him over to Mr. Smith for safekeeping. It was about 50 miles from where we were, and I figured the prisoner and I could take turns riding. I suggested to McBride that one of the men go to Mobridge and get fresh horses for the rest of them. I left them looking after me. I hadn't gone over half a mile when I heard the horse coming up beside me. It was McBride. He had tied a handkerchief on his bald head, making him look somewhat comical. He said, "Tex, here's your hat. The men didn't mean anything by saying you look like our horses. We just were worn and hungry. Besides, all of us have blistered feet. Who in the hell would have thought those outlaws stealing all we had to eat?" I asked him where he had made camp. He said he didn't know because it was dark and when they bedded down. He said he would know the place if he saw it again, though. I suggested we take a look. I told him my prisoner and I would go one way and he could travel in the other, and we'd both travel in a circle, keeping a sharp eye out for the tracks of 7 horses ahead of cattle. McBride said, "I'll go with you." We stayed together and went due north, stopping at a small hill. I was looking over towards the east when I heard the captain exclaim and looked up at him to see what was wrong. He was grinning like a traveling rat. Had spotted 7 head of horses and 4 saddles and 2 beds. That was their camp, right where they had left it. I told him to go back and get the others, and bless me if he didn't head out in the wrong direction. I called him back and pointed the right direction to him. He rode off shaking his head. As soon as McBride brought me my horse, I took my prisoner onto Bullhead. That outlaw signed his name as Tom Ketchum. I laughed and said, "Who says you're Ketchum?" But he made no further comment, and was taken to the guardhouse at his government post. He broke out some 3 weeks later. I hired 5 Indians there, went back and got a herd of cattle that had been turned loose about 25 miles from the east side of Morris Holdings. There were cattle in the herd that belonged to Montana and North Dakota, showing that they had been driven over 2,000 miles before they had been bothered. Most of the cattle belonged to men who owned less than 100 head. I learned later that some of the cattle had been missing from their range for about 6 months or so. The rustlers would be found to buy the stolen cattle as soon as they had crossed the Missouri River. It was more than likely someone was waiting to market the cattle at one time. I went from Bullhead back to the ranch. George Adams and his wife were still there. She was in terrible shape and unable to get out of bed. The doctor had been out to check on her and left the cell for treatment, but she wasn't healing fast. I soon went back to the cow wagon to check on the hands. I took the mail out to them. I learned Ben Steen was making a real hand now. The boys told me Charlie made sure he was glad that I was back, for he needed a new pair of pants. He had worn out his only pair, and didn't have the money to buy with. He had lost his money in a crap game. Ben had lost all his money, too, and he surely did not look ragged. He surely did look ragged. I knew that Mr. and Mrs. Hardy would be on the wagon the next day, so I gave Charlie a pair of pants I had in my bedroll. They were about 2 sizes too small, but he squeezed into them all the same. Ben was not presentable to meet Mrs. Hardy, so he didn't come to the roundup the next day, though he helped make the drive. He stayed out of sight and would not come to get his dinner. He got hungry and went into a thicket of bulrush, and he began grazing on the bullberries to satisfy his appetite. He disturbed an old she-bear and her 2 6-month-old cubs, and the old bear decided she would pounce on Ben. She made a sneak attack upon him and almost up on him before he knew it. He put up an awful foot race to save himself from being hugged by that bear. It was not over half a mile from the roundup. Mrs. Hardy was sitting on her horse watching the work, and she heard him as he yelled for help. The bear had cut him off from his horse, and he was headed for the roundup for dear life, scarcely out of reach of the bear. Mrs. Hardy was looking towards the creek where I knew Ben had stopped. I saw one of the boys leave the roundup on that side and start off in a dead run. Mrs. Hardy followed after him. I saw Mr. Hardy start from the middle of the roundup, very nearly causing a stampede. He ran his horse through the herd, and soon I heard shot after shot being fired. It wasn't long until Mrs. Hardy came back. She told me that the bear had caught a man and had torn all his clothes off but his boots, and that Mr. Hardy and John Young, the cowboy who had left the roundup ahead of her, had shot the bear, but hadn't killed it. It had gone back into the bulrush on the creek, and Mr. Hardy wanted me to come and help him kill it. I asked her if the cowboy was dead. She said no, but that his clothes were strings and rags, and he had gone to the wagon. Mr. Hardy didn't know where the bear was, but had seen the cubs. The men circled the thicket and went into it. I had not gone far until I found blood on the ground and knew the old bear was wounded. I knew if she would charge me. I hunted the thicket out pretty well, and had almost given up when I looked in the branch of one edge of the thicket and saw the old bear and her young ones. I motioned to the others to come. Mrs. Hardy cried out for me not to shoot those bears. The 2 little ones were putting mud in the old bear's side where she had been shot. The blood was flowing fast. Both were working as faithfully as little children would to save their mother. Mr. Hardy and John took the little cubs to the ranch, and I put the old bear out of her troubles. One of the little cubs hanged itself that night by climbing into the wagon bed and cutting a rope around the wagon bow and jumping out of the wagon. The rope was not long enough to let Sweet touch the ground, but the other cub became as tame as a dog and was a favorite with the boys. But Ben could never stand him to put his paw in his pockets as he did the other cowboys, who usually carried sweets for the little fellow. I was on the ranch one day about 2 months later, and one of Mr. Hardy's friends happened to be there and had taken a fancy to Milt, the cub. He had been sitting on his shoulder and was smoking a cigar. He was just telling Mr. Hardy that he was going to take Milt back to Chicago when he went. He offered $100 for him. He drew a mouthful of smoke and pulled down Milt's head and blew the smoke into the bear's face. The cub jerked his head loose from him and drew back his little paw and slapped the man right in the face, knocking him out of his chair. Milt screamed and scampered out of the room as if he knew he was going to get a whipping. The man was so mad that when he got through blowing this from his nose, he told Mr. Hardy he wouldn't have that damn bear, and he would give him $10 to let him shoot it. Everybody got a big laugh out of it because Hardy told him he shouldn't have blown smoke in the cub's face. Well, he shouldn't have. Mr. Pence was shipping cattle in from Texas and Old Mexico almost every 24 hours, and all hands that could be spared were at the ranch branding and spraying cattle. I was working almost night and day. Mr. Hardy had been called to Evarts to attend court. Evarts was on the east side of the Missouri River, south of Mobridge, and about 100 miles from Morristown. The Milwaukee Railroad had its terminus there. To my way of thinking, there are a few things more tragic than a town that has crumbling to nothing. Sometimes between 1905 and 1909, Evarts became a ghost town, and LeBeau became a frontier shipping point on the East Bluffs above the Missouri. In LeBeau, Dode, the only son of one of the most influential raw western cowboy men, Murdo McKenzie, was shot to death by Bud Stevens. Dode was shot in the Pile de France saloon, which had been once headquarters for the Dakota part of the Matador Land and Cattle Company. Dode was working for his dad, who was handling the Matador affairs at the time. Bud Stevens had been a former cowboy on the Matador back in Texas. Stevens was somehow acquitted, but it was generally felt that this was one of the most wantonly cruel murders on those wild cattle kingdom days. No doubt it sounded like a deep-toned death knell for the frontier shipping point of that town, and it, too, was to be destined to crumble to nothingness. Dode had befriended Bud many times. It seems a little trading post town was a festive mood for Christmas when 3 shots cut through the chilly December morning, and a young man whose only fault was whiskey clutched at his chest where the first bullet had struck, then vainly staggered for the door of the Stevens and maliciously pumped 2 more shots into his back. His victim then stumbled to the dusty street and died in the arms of Ambrose Benoist. LeBeau was established in 1875 by a black-bearded Frenchman, Antoine LeBeau, but the town died out a long time due to railroads bypassing it. Later years, Milwaukee and St. Louis ran a spur out to it, and a bit of life was pumped back into the little place. A few months after Dode McKenzie, David G., died in her streets, a fire started on Main Street to cause the loss of many dollars. The town continued to struggle, somewhat half-heartedly, to survive and rebuild. The Matador began pulling cattle out of the Dakota Range. No Matador herd again ever enters the town of entered from LeBeau. Matador cowboys stayed away from the town. 2 months after the first fire, a second struck, and the once lively little shipping point ceased to exist, except for caved-in cellars, crumbling sidewalks, broken brick, and high weeds. Even the railroad tracks were pulled up. Dode was buried in Trinidad, Colorado, and Murdo McKenzie, tycoon of the Old West, lived out his life a heartbroken man. Thus, another chapter of the Old West was closed, a town and its excitement regulated to history. Chapter 14. Death of Nellie Woods. At the C7, several from the cowboys from Texas come with the cattle. 4 stayed and worked, and the others headed right back home. Sam Hawkins was one of who stayed about 2 months, then quit. He was a very good rider and wanted better wages than the other hands. He figured himself to be a bit extra. I had little use for him, so he was putting the high gainer at his boss. When Mr. Hardy came back from a trip from Chicago, Sam hit him up for a bossing job. He was told that there was no opening, and he decided to leave and go back to Texas. He gave us a little excitement before he left. Mr. Pence was at the ranch, and most of his cowhands were around when Sam decided he wanted to have his picture made while riding a pigeon horse. He picked on a roan PX that Montana Slim had ridden the year before, and I had only been the one to ride him since. Slim had lost his job for getting drunk and neglecting his duties. Sam asked Mr. Hardy if he could ride the roan, and he was given permission. I had the horse wrangler bring him up and told the boys to get ready for some fun. Sam had one of the boys ear the roan down while he saddled him, then mounted. He just thought he would sit tall in the saddle for his picture. He hit the horse for the first jump he made, and struck him for the second, but was too high above the horse to reach him. When he hit the ground, he hit on his feet standing straight up. Everyone laughed at Sam and told him I could ride the roan. Sam bet Mr. Hardy $50 I couldn't ride that horse. If I did ride him, Mr. Hardy was to share the 50 with me. I stepped up the horse, pulling off the bridle as I went by him. He went after me for all he was worth. Around the corral 3 times we went to the cowboys yelling from all directions. I was using Sam's quirt with all my might. Someone opened the gate, and we went out. The maddened brute headed straight for the Hay Creek, and about 200 yards from the corral. He missed the crossing on the creek by about 30 yards, and we hit the bank, stopped dead, and I plunged headlong to the bottom of the creek, all spread out like a bullfrog. I was expecting him to try to jump the creek, but he stopped and watched me make a bullfrog dive into 4 feet of water. When I came back to the corral, Mr. Pence and Mr. Hardy had to take my picture as I was wet and muddy as a drowned rat. Sam was willing to give up the money since I'd whipped the horse for 50 or 60 yards after he had gone through the gate, and had thrown up his head and was running when he came back to the creek bank. We called off the bet, and Sam left that day. Soon after, I got a letter from my parents saying that they had left the old home and were living in Gaines County near my old little ranch. After hearing from them, I had the worst state of homesickness I ever had. I dreaded the coming of cold winter again in Dakota. No winds blow colder than the Dakota blizzards. I thought of poor John and the cowboys who had frozen the winter before. I also learned from their letter that Myrtle Ashley had married and settled down on the farm. I never did drink or play cards, but things were slow as I ambled into Lemon. I hadn't been there long when I saw a young punk kicking the daylights out of an old man who weighed about 215. The young man was drunk and just wanted to pick a fight. I had seen the beginning of the fracas and didn't like the difference in ages, so I knocked the bully chap flat on his back, putting him to sleep by using my quirt on his head. This caused a bit of excitement for the young fellow, who had 2 chums that thought he would be the first to whip me. I saw another man whisper something to them, and they changed their minds fast. I learned later that the 2 were not so fast with the gun, had been told I was, so they decided to leave. I helped the old man to his feet and went on looking around the town with nothing in particular to do. While I was gone, some of the boys had gone to the settlement to dance. They had been served some pumpkin pie and talked on and on about how good it was. They even mentioned they wished they could have some of it out at the ranch now and then. One of the ladies heard them talking and asked her husband to take a load out to the ranch to sell. Then the couple visited the ranch I was still gone, and Mr. and Mrs. Hardy were away. The boys had been drinking and celebrating, and were so pretty well organized. The poor old farmer drove up to the ranch hands and offered his load for sale. The boys just made fun of him and his pumpkins. They said something about how they liked the pies at the dance, and thought his wife might like to buy some pies from him. The cowboys thought the farmer should just dance for them. They made him jig around while he would slow up a bit, or wasn't dancing to one suit him. They would shoot at his feet, and he would get a little faster each time. They nearly danced the poor man to death before they let him stop. When they did let him stop, he was tired and hot, and his tongue was hanging out. He could scarcely get back to his wagon. The boys told him to get a move on, and one of them took the back end gate of the wagon. The road crossing Hay Creek was very rough. The bank on either side was long and pretty steep. When he started up the bank, his wagon started rolling everywhere. The boys started shooting at him and whipping the team into a dead run. He didn't stop to gather his lost pumpkins. When he was over the hill and out of sight, the boys carried all those pumpkins into the potato cellar to the kitchen. When I got home that night, I found 3 of the boys trying to bake pies. Things were in a horrible mess. The boy had gotten the end of his nose shot off by one of the flylight and had tried to shoot it off. One of the other men had finished the job with a razor so as to not spoil his looks. They had used salt and oil to stop the blood and tied it up with a flour sack and thought he would do fine. They thought if he drank lost the bug juice he would get well. I learned the terrible truth about the pumpkins and felt ashamed for all their mistreatment of the man and his fine wife. The next morning I took the poor boy where he could get medical aid and told the doctor I would pay his bill to hold it from his wages. He lost about 10 days off the job for that drunken spree. I hunted up the farmer and paid him for the load of pumpkins and thanked him for his trouble and told him it never would have happened if I had been at the ranch. The farmer and his wife told me I didn't seem to be rude like the other cowboys, and they wanted to attend their church some Sunday. I hadn't been to church in many years, except the time I decided to sleep in one, so I told them I would visit them in one Sunday. A few weeks later, I went to the little church house and really enjoyed the good songs and prayers. The preacher was a middle-aged man and a fine person. I introduced myself to him after the preaching and told him I worked for the C7. I invited him to come to the ranch sometime to preach to the boys. I told him all we ever had at the ranch was a stag dance once in a while to keep them in practice. He laughed and asked if I'd like to dance. I don't do much dancing myself, but I'd like to play the fiddle and others stood around. A young woman standing near us spoke up and asked me if I'd played by note or by ear. I told her I played mostly by ear and that I used the notes since I had a scale and notes on my violin. I've been trying to learn to play by notes. Do you think you could help me? I told her I would be glad to try. I warned her I wasn't much of a music teacher since I had mostly learned from my dad. We hunted her dad in the crowd, and when she introduced us, I found he was the old gent I'd defended a lemon from the husky punk and tried to kick his sides after getting a little dog drunk. I told his daughter, Nellie, all about how I'd taken his side by the fight and probably saved his life. Their name was Woods. They invited me to their home that night. I spent most of the day next morning teaching Nellie Woods how to read notes and the scale on her new violin, but with the setting of the sun, I told them I had to go back to work. I promised Nellie I would visit her as often as my work would allow. I was trying to make it to her home on Sunday or during the week if I happened to be riding in that part of the range looking for strays. Nellie learned fast. I took my old fiddle to her place and just left it. Then when I got the chance to play for a dance or gathering, I would go by and get Nellie, and off we would go. Nellie was a highlight of my stay in Dakota. I wrote my folks back home about her and how happy I was since I'd met her. The rest of the year, 1910, flew by. It was a few days after New Year in 1911 when I received a letter asking me to attend a dance about 30 miles west from where Mr. Woods lived. The dance was to be held in Wyoming at the home of a sister of Mr. Woods. I was not personally acquainted with Mr. and Mrs. Brown, who had written me, but the dance and supper at the ranch was to be the 1st of February, and they wanted me to bring Nellie with them. We were to play the dance, so I wrote that I would be there if nothing unforeseen happened to change my plans. I wasn't sure I could go because my work was so demanding at the particular time. The snows had been particularly heavy and had fallen early. I kept busy gathering cattle for my feed pens and seeing that the hands of the ranch did their work. Mr. and Mrs. Hardy were in Chicago, and that gave me double work to do. I made arrangements for the time came of the dance, and I hitched the team to a light sleigh and headed for the Woods home. I found Mr. and Mrs. Woods preparing to go, but Nellie told us she felt something bad would happen if she went. She begged her mother not to insist. I told her I would take care of her, and I too insisted that she go. She wanted to stay with her married brother until he came back, but we all gathered her belongings and hurried her on with us. She mentioned to me that the way she had a premonition of danger, and that she was going against her will, and all the way Nellie remained thoughtful and quiet. The weather was fine, the snow was firm, and away we sped over the hills and plains, but I could not cheer up my little Nellie, try as I would. She told me we were taking our last ride together, and I saw a tear glisten on her small face. I promised her I would stay in the house and give her my pistol and let my uncle sleep it until I was ready to go home. She just sighed and snuggled close to me. Everything was going well until about 3:30 in the morning when someone caused a disturbance among the boys on the outside of the house. Most of the cowboys had gotten mighty drunk. Some couldn't stand straight enough to dance, so they had gone outside for air. Mr. Woods and Mr. Brown and 4 older men had taken the job of keeping peace. They had ordered 7 or 8 of the boys to leave the dance. They had all got their sleighs and all 3 horses were leaving when something apparently detained them. Nellie and I were in the corner of the room, tired, but playing soldier's joy, and the dancers were in the middle of the set when my violin was suddenly knocked from my shoulder and splinters flew from it, hitting me in the face. When I glanced over at Nellie, I saw her falling. I caught her in my arms, and she slumped forward in the chair. I looked into my face. She looked into my face and seemed to say, "I told you so," though her pretty lips never moved. She died instantly in my embrace. I called her name only once, then I knew it was over. A bullet from a .45 gun had been fired from the outside, coming through the double walls of the house. It hit my violin, knocking it from under my chin, and it pierced her heart. I carried Nellie from the room and put her on a bed and sent someone to get Mrs. Woods. I closed her beautiful eyes, folded her hands, and asked her to forgive me. I headed for the outside to find out who had fired the fatal bullet. I met her father on the porch and told him what had happened. I could not find my pistol and couldn't borrow one, nor could I find out who had fired that shot at Nellie. A bunch of the boys had fired in all directions, and when they left the dance, but when we overtook them, they all denied firing towards the house. Probably one who did fire to the house didn't realize he had done so, since they were all drunk. I rode back toward the house with deep sorrow burning in my heart. I drove the team that took Nellie to her final resting place. After the funeral, I stayed with her family that night, then left the next morning for the C7. I've never played the fiddle since. Okay, one more chapter. Chapter 15, Waterway of Death. I began to plan to return to Texas. Nellie's death had upset me greatly, and my one dream was to see the loved ones I'd left so far behind. But there was work to be done, and I couldn't leave just yet. I thought I might go to South America, or even Brazil. I didn't know. But one thing was sure, I wouldn't spend any more months in Dakota. Before I left, other sorrows would befall me. About the 1st of May, 4 of us cowboys were camped in the Grand River near the wagon crossing. It was known as Blanket Camp, a double log cabin on the river I remember as a waterway of death when winds began to blow in from the south. The snow melts and the creek and the rivers become rushing torrents. There had been a family camped near the river for several days, waiting for it to run drawn so they could cross. The morning we saddled our horses to leave camp, I noticed the family making preparation to leave. They had 5 children, ranging in the ages from 8 to 2 years. They were traveling in a big Studebaker wagon headed for some place in Wyoming. I became concerned about their moving out because they had to cross was a mean place. The river made a short bend just above and below, which caused the water to be rather swift at the crossing, and it was impossible to ford it when it had so much water flowing through. Besides, one of the old L7 hands and horse had drowned there a few years ago. That vicious current had probably claimed more lives than we knew about. The banks of the river on both sides below the ford were steep and high for miles. There was no crossing for cattle, for in the daytimes the water narrowed as it went to the high banks and deepened as it always stood several feet deep in water at its lowest side. As we approached the crossing on the north side, the wagon was going into the water on the south side. The wheels of that old wagon hadn't rolled for more than a few yards in the tide before swift currents started washing it downstream. The chill of the morning suddenly cut through me when I realized what was happening to the family, and I heard the little children crying out in fright. I felt helpless. I saw the team of 2 horses struggling desperately to keep a footing. The man was trying to frantically keep a hold of the lines, and I had seen what was going to happen to them before they reached the swimming water. Quickly I moved into action. I knew that unless 4 punchers fought the mad river for those 7 lives, the family was surely doomed. I jerked off my coat and leaped from my saddle, and pulling my boots when I heard one of the boys yell, "No, Byrd! No use, Byrd! They're gone! They just went under!" When I stood, I saw the wagon team were being whirled around in a spewing current. By now, though, the wagon had been washed forward the north bank. The man had gotten to the team into calmer water where they might have swam out, only to have the wicked rivers sweep them once more towards death. "Boys, we'll try to save them!" I said as I moved about, yanking my pants and chaps off. I could see the woman and her children peeping from the canvas cover of the wagon. I could stand it no longer. I sprang back into my saddle and spurred old Outlaw and headed him to the river bank at full speed, using my quirt with all my might under his flanks. I heard the boys yelling for me to stop, but paid them no mind. As Outlaw and I started over the edge of that steep, high bank, he rose high in the air and made a desperate leap as we were trying to clear the stream, which was 150 yards wide at that point. I can feel yet the roll of him under me, and his large frame vibrating to the rhythm of the saddle. I see him again as he was on that day, horse flesh at its best. He sank lower and lower, head downward until he finally hit the ice-cold water with an awful splash and sank beneath the powerful waves. As I went to the bottom with him, the other boys were riding along, watching all of us fight in the mad stream. As my head sank under those troubled waters, I breathed a prayer for help and strength for those helpless children whose cries I hear yet. Outlaw came up, snorting from the cold and fright. I managed to steer him near the middle of the stream by slapping the water at his head with my hands. I guided him in the way to be sure not to duck him under by pulling his bridle bit. We were soon beside the wagon. Little hands reached out to me and shouted encouragement and orders to the man and the woman. The man was still fighting courageously to stay seated as the water kept swelling up towards him and beating him back. They were being swept down the stream fast. The women and children were clinging to the wagon bow and to strips of the tarp corner. Once more I heard the plaintive cry of those babies as death seemed absolute. I got madder than that river and said, "God willing, I will pull you folks from the clutches of this watery grave or die trying." I didn't know whether they heard me above the roar. I looked up and saw the hands walking the bank. The man, seeing me coming, had torn away from the front of the wagon cover so that his children could be reached easier. With his help, I was able to guide two of the children mounted behind me. I also took the infant in my arms and headed for the bank. Then I drifted downstream and gradually towards the north bank. When near enough, I yelled for them to throw me the end of the ropes, which they did. Each little form was soon dragged from the strong arms to the top of the bank, and I was headed to the wagon box again. It was being carried at a terrific speed towards Big Missouri. After a good chase, I drew up beside it and got the woman up behind Outlaw and one out in front. She held one baby in her arms, and I saw my powerful horse was failing fast under the double burden of his weight. It was indeed taxed our strength to overtake the floating wagon. I swam with the man towards the bank and yelled encouragement to the woman and the little ones. "Hold still! Hold fast! Be still!" I yelled over the water. I knew none of us would hold out much longer, but we were making progress. God was with us. The horse sank beneath the waves several times before he neared the bank. The waves kept lapping side and high. The outlaw was gasping for his breath. Water streamed from his nostrils. The woman was brave, for she never became hysterical. Blood soon began to flow from Outlaw's nostrils. I steered the horse closer and closer to the bank. I had my rope, and it tied the end of the first rope till it came to the reach. This we looped around the woman's waist. The little ones followed. I took 2 strong men to pull her up to the high bank. I took the baby in my arms and waited until she was safe, and then the little one was lifted. I went back to my struggling horse. About the time the wagon team disappeared somewhere in the sharp bend of the river, my horse was drowning. He didn't have the strength to save himself. I tried to get my old saddle, but could not unfasten the cinches. He struck me with one foot and sent me to the bottom. I was so numb from the cold that I could hardly get the strength up to come back to the top. I made it to the bank, but by the time I got there, old Outlaw was gone too. I felt sick from grief, for I loved that horse. The boys dropped their ropes for me and dragged me up, safely, half dead. And those 7 faces came around me, and the little one's arms slipped around my neck. I knew Outlaw had died for a great cause. Family. We all went back to camp, dried out around the stove, and got acquainted. Mr. and Mrs. Weaver and their 5 little ones just kept gathering around me, but my horse and that cold bath put me to bed for a week. The boys made up a good-sized purse for the family since they had lost everything they owned. Mr. and Mrs. Hardy gave them use of the C7 team and wagon for their trip to Wyoming. As soon as I could, I went to town to buy a new saddle. Again, I felt strong inclinations to see my loved ones. I saw a paper while in Lemon which gave a fair account of what had happened, and gave us boys a good boost for our part in the rescue. To my way of thinking, Outlaw should have been the one who got credit. Nothing much was said about the loss of that fine animal. Mr. and Mrs. Hardy scolded me for taking such a leap on the horse. The bank was nearly 30 feet high above the water, and water nearly 20 feet deep or deeper. I'd done the only thing I was ever known to do when I see someone struggling for life. Jump in and help. Okay. I'm gonna have so much editing to do. Now, who should we read? Since I don't know who was on. Let's see who was on. Okay. Silson is on. Falcor's on. What's she reading? I haven't rated her for a while. Let's see what she's reading. She's doing ASMR stuff right now. Oh. Harp is on. No, it's right, Harp. Raid messages as usual. And I will hopefully see you all tomorrow for some fairy tales. Have a good night.
In the hollow of the night, shadows weave and twist. The wolf has told his stories, wrapped in mystic mist, lurking in the silence where the echoes softly play. The echoes of forgotten tales, dimming as they sway. The hours drip like candle wax, slowly melting gold. Lands of frost and twilight, secrets yet untold. The forest breathes a shiver, its ancient heartbeats thrum. Underneath the silver glow, the wild whispers come. Time to close the book, let the pages fall. You've roamed the winding paths, now heed the twilight.